15 years since the divorce, and you're still as poor and shabby as ever, huh?
I feel comfortable dressed like this, but that's enough for me.
A failure always finds an excuse to hide how pathetic he is. He probably dragged himself to the reunion just to beg for a loan.
$240 million, sitting in a folder on a lawyer's desk 40 miles away, while a room full of people laughed at a joke that wasn't true anymore. Nobody in that room knew what was coming. They thought the joke was on me. It wasn't. My name is Marcus Delaney. I'm 47 years old. For most of my life, I believed that if you did the work quietly and let your results speak, people would eventually hear them. I was wrong about the quietly part. I was right about everything else. I grew up thinking loud was the same as strong. My father was a mechanic who never raised his voice in 30 years of marriage. And I used to think that made him weak, until I watched him fix things other men had given up on, with nothing but patience and the right tool at the right time. It took me until my 30s to understand he'd been showing me the only kind of strength that lasts. The gymnasium at Peachtree Ridge High still smelled the way it did in 1997. Floor wax and old rubber. And somebody had strung up a banner that said Class of 2001. 15 years in gold letters that were already starting to sag on one end. I stood near the drink table, longer than I meant to, holding a plastic cup of punch I wasn't going to finish, watching the door. Renata came in at 8:15, and the room noticed the way rooms notice her. A small shift in the noise, heads turning without meaning to. She was wearing a green dress that cost more than my first car, and her hand was looped through Douglas's arm, the way you hold onto a railing on a staircase you don't quite trust. I watched her scan the room before she saw me, and, for half a second, before she rearranged her face into something bright and performative, I caught something else underneath it. Tired, maybe more than tired. Before we get into how we got to that gymnasium, I want you to sit with something for a second. 15 years is long enough to become a stranger to the people who used to know you best. It's also long enough to become someone they never bothered to actually look at again. Renata hadn't looked at me in 15 years. She'd only ever looked at the version of me she left behind. Douglas shook my hand too hard, the way men do when they're compensating for something they can't name, and his palm was damp. Up close, his suit didn't fit quite right across the shoulders, like it had been tailored for a heavier man he used to be. I noticed the way his eyes moved to the door every few minutes, checking it, the way you check a door when you're not sure who might walk through it and what they might say. "Marcus Delaney," Renata said, loud enough for the people near us to hear, tilting her head like she was examining a piece of furniture at a yard sale. "Still driving that same old truck out front? I saw it in the parking lot. Some things never change, huh?" A few people laughed, the easy laugh of people who don't know they're supposed to feel uncomfortable yet. I smiled and said something about the truck running fine after all these years, which was true, and let it sit there. I didn't correct her. I didn't mention the truck was the one I'd bought myself, the week our divorce was finalized, on purpose, and kept out of stubbornness and a little bit of nostalgia I never fully explained to anyone. Anger is a poor tenant. It moves in, it never pays rent, and it wrecks the place before it leaves. I'd learned that the hard way, a long time ago, and I wasn't going to hand it the keys again in a high school gymnasium over a joke about a truck. I just smiled and let the room believe whatever it wanted to believe about me. There would be time, later, for the room to believe something else. The divorce came 4 years after that diner conversation, and by the time it arrived, it felt less like an ending and more like a door finally swinging open after years of being held shut by someone leaning against it from the other side. Renata told me, sitting across from me at our own kitchen table, the same table Wesley had once used to sketch his treasure map, that she'd met someone who made her feel like her life was actually going somewhere. She didn't say Douglas's name that night. She didn't need to. I already knew, the way you know a storm has arrived before the first drop hits the window, from the particular quality of the silence that had settled over our house for months before she finally spoke. I want to be honest about something here, because there's no use telling this story if I'm not going to tell it straight. Part of me was relieved. Not happy, not at peace, but relieved. The way you're relieved when a tooth that's been aching for years finally comes out, pain and all. I had spent 4 years watching money drift out of accounts I couldn't fully track, watching a family absorb my wife a little more completely, with every holiday and every favor and every quiet correction of my memory. And some tired, worn-down part of me had already left that marriage long before Renata said the words out loud. The settlement wasn't cruel on paper. It looked, to any outside observer, like a fair enough split for a marriage with no children yet and modest joint assets. What it didn't account for, what nobody in that mediation room accounted for, was the money that had already quietly left the marriage years earlier, routed through Wesley's growth vehicle, and never fully returned. Money that existed on old statements sitting in a manila envelope in a garage 40 minutes away. Statements nobody asked to see, because nobody but Terrence and I knew to ask. Our son, Caleb, was born the year before the divorce, and custody split the way. Custody splits when a judge is doing arithmetic, instead of understanding weekends and alternating holidays. A schedule drawn up to be fair to the adults and only accidentally fair to the child living inside it. Renata moved in with Douglas within 8 months of the papers being signed, and I watched, from the particular distance a father learns to tolerate, as Caleb's world reorganized itself, round a man who bought him things I couldn't afford, and never once asked what Caleb actually wanted. I threw myself into work, because work was the one place grief didn't follow me in. I left the trucking company 2 years after the divorce, and took a position at a small logistics software startup with 4 employees, and a founder who believed, correctly as it turned out, that the shipping industry was about to be reshaped by better routing algorithms. I wrote code until 2 in the morning more nights than I can count. Not because anyone asked me to, but because the work was the only conversation I was having that didn't leave me feeling smaller than when it started. Terrence and I kept talking, maybe twice a year, always over the same diner coffee, always with the same manila folder growing thicker between us. He'd moved from paralegal work into a small forensic accounting practice by then, the kind of quiet expertise that never makes headlines, but occasionally unravels a fortune. And he started teaching me, patiently, how to read the shape of Wesley's transfers, how the growth vehicle had, over the years, folded itself into something considerably larger and considerably less legal, a network of shell entities that eventually financed, among other things, a car dealership group in 3 counties, the one Douglas would come to run. I want to be clear that for a long time this wasn't a plan. It was a habit, the same habit that made me the kind of man who reads instruction manuals cover to cover and checks a locked door twice, an old discomfort I couldn't quite put down. I wasn't building a case. I was just refusing to stop paying attention because I'd learned the hard way what happens to people who look away. The startup grew. 4 employees became 40, then 400. As the routing algorithms I'd helped build got licensed by bigger and bigger carriers, and somewhere in the middle of that growth I found myself, almost without noticing the exact day it happened, holding a piece of a company that was suddenly worth more than anything I had ever imagined owning. I registered my share of it under a holding company with a name that meant nothing to anyone, Holloway Junction Partners, named for a stretch of railroad crossing near my father's shop, and I kept my name off every press release I could keep it off of. I wasn't hiding out of shame. I was hiding because I had learned, from watching Renata's family for years, exactly what people do to a man once they know what he's worth. Caleb was 12 when I started quietly paying for things Renata never knew I was paying for. A tutor when his grades slipped in a year, I later learned was the year Douglas, and Renata's marriage nearly ended the first time. A summer camp Renata told him she couldn't afford. A car when he turned 16 that Renata believed had come from a school fundraiser scholarship. I never told him it was me. I told the camp director, and the tutor, and the dealership that sold the car, to route everything through Holloway Junction, and to never, under any circumstance, mention my name. I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because he was my son, and because I had decided a long time ago that whatever else got taken from me in that divorce, I was not going to let him grow up believing his father had disappeared. By the time Terrence called me on a Thursday afternoon to tell me that Douglas's dealership group had taken on debt from a lender that had, through 2 layers of holding companies, become quietly and entirely controlled by Holloway Junction, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt, more than anything, like a man watching a long equation finally resolve to the answer he'd suspected from the very first line. Back in the gymnasium, the DJ had moved on from something slow to a song. Everybody's class had danced to at prom, and the crowd near the drink table had thickened, the way crowds do around free food and old gossip. Renata hadn't moved on from the truck joke. She'd found a second wind. "You know what I always admired about you, Marcus," she said, loud enough again, her wine glass tilting slightly in her hand. "You never let ambition get in your way. Some people spend their whole lives chasing something bigger. You just stayed exactly where you were." She smiled when she said it, the kind of smile designed to look like warmth from a distance and read as something else entirely up close. A woman I half remembered from AP History, Denise, laughed a little too quickly, the laugh of someone eager to be on the right side of whatever this was. Douglas didn't laugh. Douglas was looking at his phone, and I noticed his jaw tighten at something on the screen before he slid it back into his pocket and reached for his drink instead. "I like where I ended up," I said, keeping my voice even, and I meant it more than anyone in that room could have understood. Turns out staying still isn't always the same as standing still. Renata's eyes narrowed just slightly, the way they used to when a comment didn't land the way she'd planned it. She recovered fast, turning to the small crowd that had gathered. "Anyway, Marcus was always sweet, just never had much drive. Some of us wanted more out of life, that's all." She said it lightly, like it cost her nothing, and maybe it didn't, not yet. I want to pause here and tell you something I've come to understand about people like Renata. And I say this without cruelty, only clarity. Some people confuse volume for truth. If they say a thing loudly enough, in front of enough witnesses, they start to believe the room's silence is agreement rather than discomfort. Renata had been saying some version of that sentence about me for 15 years, to our son, to her family, to anyone who'd listen. And nobody had ever once told her she was wrong, because nobody had ever had a reason to check. That was about to change. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, a single vibration, and when I glanced down under the table, I saw Terrence's name and a single line of text. "Confirmed. Meeting set for Thursday. Bring the folder." I put the phone away and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as quiet. Not excitement, not vengeance, just the particular calm of a man who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and can finally see, clearly, exactly where he's about to set it down. Across the room, our son Caleb walked in, 22 now, tall in a way that still caught me off guard every time I saw him, wearing a blazer that didn't quite fit right across the shoulders, the way his stepfather's suits never did either, a small detail I noticed and immediately felt guilty for noticing. He scanned the room, found me first, and something in his face relaxed, just slightly, the way it always did when he located me in a crowded space before he located anyone else. Renata saw him too, and called him over, and for a moment the 2 versions of his life stood close enough to touch, his mother's arm looping through his the way it had looped through Douglas's earlier, pulling him gently into her orbit, while I stood a few feet away, holding a cup of punch I still hadn't finished. "Caleb, tell everyone what you're up to these days," Renata said, beaming, already composing the story before he could tell it himself. "He's interning this summer. Very impressive company, very exclusive." Caleb's eyes flicked to me, just for a second, something careful and complicated passing between us that nobody else in the room caught. "Yeah," he said slowly, "Holloway Junction Partners. It's a pretty interesting place to work." I watched Renata's face for any flicker of recognition at the name, and found none. Why would she? It meant nothing to her. Not yet. But I saw Douglas's head turn, just slightly, the way a man's head turns, when he hears two words that shouldn't mean anything, and somehow do. And for the briefest moment his eyes met mine across the gymnasium, and something passed between us two, quieter than fear, but headed there. Thursday's meeting took place in Ungfrent's room, on the 14th floor of a building I own 2/3 of. Though the reception downstairs still called me Mr. Delaney like I was a vendor here for a routine appointment. Exactly the way I preferred it. Terrence arrived 12 minutes early, the way he always had since our diner days, carrying a leather folio that had replaced the manila envelope years ago, but, held in spirit, the same contents patiently multiplied. He laid it out on the table, the way a surgeon lays out instruments, in order, without ceremony. The original growth vehicle statements, from 16 years earlier. The shell entities Wesley had built over a decade, each one a Russian doll opening into another, until the last doll held something real, a controlling stake in a regional lending group that had, 4 years ago, quietly acquired the debt financing 3 car dealerships across 3 counties, including the flagship location Douglas had taken over from his own father, and expanded, unwisely, twice. He's leveraged to the edge, Terrence said, sliding a printout across the table, his voice carrying the particular flatness forensic accountants get when they're delivering numbers that would ruin a lesser man's week. 3 floor plan loans, 2 of them past due on interest, and a personal guarantee on the largest one that ties Douglas's home equity directly to the dealership's performance. If the lender calls the loan, he loses the flagship location within 90 days. Maybe less. And the lender is us, I said. Not a question. The lender is a company that Holloway Junction acquired 11 months ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with Douglas at the time, Terrence said. We bought a regional lending group because the routing algorithms flagged their client base as an efficiency opportunity for the trucking side of the business. Douglas's dealership just happened to be sitting inside it. You didn't build this to get him. You built a company, and he happened to owe it money. I sat with that for a moment, because it mattered to me, more than Terrence probably understood, that this hadn't started as a hunt. I hadn't spent 16 years constructing an elaborate trap for a man I barely knew. I had spent 16 years building something honest, and the truth had simply arrived at his doorstep on its own, the way truth tends to, eventually. If you give it enough time and don't get in its way. There's something else, Terrence said, and here his voice changed, softened, in a way it rarely did. He slid a second folder across the table, thinner than the first. I went further back than you asked me to. The original growth vehicle account, the one Wesley opened in your name back in the beginning. I found where the missing money actually went. I opened the folder. Wire transfers, 12 of them across 3 years. Each one routed from the joint account Renata and I had shared, through Wesley's consultancy, into a personal account held solely in Renata's maiden name, an account I had never known existed. Not household expenses, not investments gone wrong. A private account, fed quietly for 3 years, that had funded, among other things, a down payment on a condominium Renata had purchased 8 months before she ever mentioned Douglas's name to me. I didn't feel the anger I expected to feel. I felt something closer to grief, old and familiar. The particular grief of learning that a story you'd told yourself for 16 years, a story where you'd simply failed to notice what was happening to your own marriage, was actually a story about a woman who had known exactly what she was doing the entire time, and had simply been better at hiding it than I'd been at looking. You don't have to use any of this, Terrence said quietly, watching my face. The dealership piece, that's just business. Nobody has to know you're behind it. And if the loan gets called, it gets called on its own merits. Nothing personal about it. But this, he tapped the thinner folder. This is yours to decide what to do with. I can put it back in the drawer, and neither of us ever mentions it again. I thought about Caleb, 22 years old, standing in that gymnasium between 2 versions of a story he'd never gotten to hear in full. I thought about 15 years of a woman calling me a man who never had much drive, in front of people who believed her because nobody had ever handed them a reason not to. No, I said, put it back in the drawer for now, but I want it ready. Because there's a difference between using something to hurt someone and finally telling the truth in a room that's been lying to itself for 15 years. I only want to do the second one. Terrence closed the folder and nodded slowly, the way my father used to nod at an engine that was finally, after a long diagnosis, beginning to make sense. The invitation to the Ridgeview Children's Hospital Gala arrived at Renata's house the same way every other invitation on that list had, printed on heavy cardstock, hand-addressed, with no indication anywhere on it that the foundation funding the event had been quietly seeded 3 years earlier by Holloway Junction partners, or that the man signing checks behind the scenes had once been married to one of the guests. I hadn't planned to attend as anything other than what I always was at these events. A name on a donor list nobody bothered to look up. But 3 weeks after the reunion, Terrence called me with news that changed the shape of the evening entirely. The loan got called, he said. Not by us. The lending group's board did it on their own. Standard procedure once a floor plan loan crosses 90 days past due on 2 properties. Douglas has 30 days to refinance, or the flagship location goes into receivership. He's already missed 2 payments trying to find a new lender, and nobody's biting, because word's gotten around about the debt load. He paused. He's going to be at the gala. I checked the guest list. He's hoping to corner potential investors there. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment after that call, looking out at a backyard my father never got to see, thinking about 30 days and 90 days and 15 years, all these numbers stacking up into a single week that hadn't asked my permission to arrive. The gala was held in the atrium of a downtown hotel. Glass ceiling, string quartet, the particular hush of a room full of people trying to look like their money didn't matter to them. I saw Renata first, in a black dress this time instead of green, standing near the silent auction tables, with a drink she wasn't drinking. And I saw the tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there 15 years ago. The tightness of a woman managing more than she was letting on. Caleb found me before I found him, weaving through the crowd with the particular urgency of someone who'd rehearsed what he wanted to say. "Dad," he said, low, close, "Mom doesn't know I know about Holloway Junction." I looked it up after the reunion. I looked up everything. He searched my face. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I didn't want you loving me for the wrong reasons," I said. And I meant it. Though standing there, I could see how thin that answer sounded next to 22 years of silence. "I wanted you to know me first. The money was never supposed to be the thing that introduced us properly." He nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they're deciding, in real time, whether to be angry or relieved, and landed somewhere that looked like both. "Okay," he said, "okay, but no more secrets after tonight. Whatever's about to happen, I want to actually understand it. While it's happening, not read about it later." I didn't get the chance to promise him that, because that was the moment the Foundation's director stepped up to the small stage near the string quartet and asked for everyone's attention. And I watched, across the room, as the Master of Ceremonies invited the evening's largest anonymous donor to say a few words, a courtesy extended every year to whichever donor had quietly funded the largest share of the hospital's new pediatric wing, a courtesy I had declined every year until this one. I walked to the small stage with a glass of water in my hand instead of wine, and I felt the room's attention shift the way it had shifted for Renata in the gymnasium 3 weeks earlier. Except this time nobody was performing brightness at me. This time the room was simply curious, the way rooms get curious about money whose face they've never seen. "My name is Marcus Delaney," I said, and I watched Renata's head turn sharply from across the room, her drink stopping halfway to her mouth. "Some of you know me. Most of you don't, and that's been on purpose. 16 years ago I was married to a woman in this room, and our divorce is not a story I intend to tell tonight, because it isn't really the point of this evening, and it isn't really anyone's business but ours." I paused, found Renata's eyes across the atrium, and held them, steady, without cruelty. "What I do want to say is something my father taught me a long time ago, working in a garage most of you have never heard of. He used to say that a man's worth was never in what he said loudly about himself. It was in what he built quietly, while nobody was watching to give him credit for it. I saw Douglas near the back of the room, his face going through several colors in quick succession as understanding arrived. I saw him reach for his phone, then stop, then simply stand there, exposed, in the particular way a man stands when he realizes the floor he's been walking on has just been revealed to be someone else's floor entirely. Holloway Junction Partners has funded this hospital's pediatric wing for the last 3 years, I continued. It's also, as of 11 months ago, the majority stakeholder in the lending group that finances several regional businesses, including, as it happens, a dealership group some of you might recognize. I didn't look at Douglas when I said it, though I felt every eye in the room find him anyway. I only mention it tonight because I think it's worth saying, once out loud, in a room full of people, that the things we build quietly are just as real as the things we announce loudly. Maybe more real. Thank you all for coming. The kids upstairs thank you too. I stepped down from the stage into a silence that lasted exactly as long as silences last before 300 people. Remember, they're supposed to be somewhere else, looking at someone else, talking about something else. Renata crossed the room toward me, before I'd fully found my footing on the atrium floor, her face doing something I hadn't seen it do in 15 years, something like genuine confusion, trying to reassemble itself into composure and failing. "Is that true?" she said. Quiet now, none of the gymnasium volume left in her at all. "All of it, every word," I said. "Been building it since about 2 years after the divorce. I never hid it, because I was ashamed, Renata. I hid it, because I finally understood, watching your family for 4 years, exactly what people do to a man once they know what he's worth. I wasn't ready to find out what you'd do." She didn't have an answer for that, not right away. And for the first time in 15 years I watched her stand in front of me without a single prepared line ready to deploy. And there was no triumph in it for me, only a strange, quiet the sadness of finally seeing someone clearly after years, of only seeing the version of them you'd built out of old hurt. Behind her, near the silent auction tables, Douglas was already gone, slipped out a side door, and I understood, watching the space where he'd been standing, that the 30 days on his loan were about to become a much smaller number than that, and that I felt, watching it happen, almost nothing at all. The revenge, if that's even the right word for it, had already happened years earlier, in a garage, in a diner, in 400 nights of code nobody thanked me for. Tonight was just the room, finally catching up to a truth that had been sitting quietly in a folder the whole time. The weeks after the gala moved slower than I expected them to. I think some part of me had imagined that revealing the truth would feel like a door slamming shut on an old chapter, dramatic and final. But real life rarely closes doors that cleanly. Instead, it felt like a long exhale, the kind that takes longer than you think it will, and leaves you a little unsteady once it's finally finished. Douglas's dealership group filed for reorganization 6 weeks later. I want to be honest and say I took no pleasure in reading about it in the local business paper. A small article on page 11 that most people in that gymnasium would never see. I had told Terrence, the week after the gala, that I didn't want to be involved in any decision about whether the lending group extended him more time or called in the rest of what he owed. And I meant it. The board made its own decision, guided by numbers that had nothing to do with a truck joke in a high school gymnasium. Douglas kept 2 of the 3 locations, in the end, restructured under new terms, and I found that I was glad of it, mostly for Caleb's sake, who still had to sit across a Thanksgiving table from the man some years, whether I liked it or not. Renata called me twice in the month after the gala. The first call I let go to voicemail. The second I answered, and we talked for 11 minutes, mostly about Caleb, a little about the dealership. And right at the end, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from her in 15 years, she said she was sorry not for the divorce, but for 15 years of jokes at my expense that she now understood had never been about me at all. I told her I appreciated her saying it, though an apology 15 years late doesn't erase the 15 years. It only makes them easier to set down. Caleb and I started having dinner every other Sunday. He asked me once why I'd let people believe what they wanted about the truck and the apartment and the man who never had much drive. And I told him, because for a long time, I wasn't sure I believed anything different myself. Rebuilding a life doesn't happen all at once. It happens in a garage, at 2 in the morning, in small private victories nobody claps for. It was at Caleb's college graduation, 18 months after the gala, that I saw Elena again, the quiet girl from the art room, who'd once told me my robotics diagrams looked like real engineering work. The only person in 4 years who'd meant it. Divorced amicably a decade ago, raising 2 kids, running her own architecture firm, and never once attending a reunion. I told her everything over coffee: the garage, the folder, Holloway Junction, the gala, and she listened the way nobody had in 15 years, without checking whether the story might become useful to her. "You just told me you're worth more than most people in that gymnasium will see in 10 lifetimes, she said. "And it's the least interesting thing you've said all afternoon." We married 2 years later, in her backyard. My father's workbench still sits in my garage, the drawer empty now, the folder filed away properly, its work finished. Some evenings I go out there anyway, just to remember the man who taught me that quiet work outlasts loud talk, every time, if you're patient enough to let it. There's one more thing Elena pointed out to me almost a year into our marriage. Sitting on the porch one night, she asked whether I'd ever actually grieved the marriage itself, separate from the betrayal, separate from the money, just the plain human loss of a life I'd once planned to have. I hadn't. I'd turned my grief into a folder, into evidence, into a decade of proof, and it had saved me, but it had let me skip the plainer part, where a younger version of me had simply loved someone and lost her, without a spreadsheet attached to it. Elena didn't try to fix that. She just sat with me while I finally said it out loud. And that felt like the real end of the story, more than any gala reveal ever could. If there's a lesson in this, it's not that money is the best revenge. It's smaller and slower than that. The people who mock you for standing still have usually never once asked what you were building down there, in the quiet. They mistake your patience for your ceiling. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let them keep believing that, right up until the truth simply becomes too large to ignore. I still drive that same old truck some days, just because I like the sound of the engine turning over on a cold morning. Some things really don't change. I've just finally stopped needing anyone else to understand why that's a good thing. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had someone underestimate you for years, only to find out the truth all at once? I'd love to hear your story below. And if this one hit home, hit subscribe. We've got a lot more of these coming.